Thank you. Good afternoon. Welcome to monastics, friends, and neighbors. On behalf of the Buddhist Council of Greater St. Louis, thank you for joining us for our socially engaged Buddhism event, Paradigm Shift from Fear to Freedom. The Buddhist Council of Greater St. Louis is composed of over 20 area temples and sitting groups, representing just about every Buddhist tradition there is. The complete listing of these groups can be found on our website, buddhistcouncilstl.org. We also have a Facebook page that is updated with our event schedules. We are glad to see the rapid decline of COVID cases, which has prevented us from having our meetings in person. But it's sad the United States had to experience almost 1 million deaths, many of which may have been prevented. We hope that in the future, people will be more accepting of the science of mask wearing and vaccines so that we don't have to experience as much suffering and death. However, our program is very timely today, given the unfortunate Russian invasion of Ukraine. Especially terrifying is the shelling by Russia of the largest nuclear power plant in the world, or in Europe, I apologize. It underscores how important accurate journalism and reporting is for an informed populace. But I'm reminded of Buddhist teaching that we should always strive to be kind to living beings. And also I'm reminded of the words of the Bodhisattva Fred Rogers, also known as Mr. Rogers, who said, when you feel sad about disasters that happen, look at the helpers. Indeed, there are so many acts of kindness going on, such as Chef Jose Andres, who has traveled to Poland to prepare meals for those who haven't eaten a hot meal in many days. People opening up their homes to house newly arrived refugees, and those governments that are loosening restrictions at the border so that the flow of people can be opened up. The events sponsored by the Buddhist Council for the past couple of years has collected funds for the St. Louis area food bank. And today we are once again asking for a donation in any amount that you may be able to offer to help hungry families in our area. Even just $1 can feed up to 4 people, so a little bit goes a long way. We have the link to donate on the chat. Our first speaker today is Dr. Rosan Yoshida, longtime director of the Missouri Zen Center. He was ordained in 1982 and has been a professor of comparative religion at Tokyo University. He is an active participant in the Parliament of World Religions. He has written and been involved in the translations of many books about Buddhism and articles. His topic is Shift from Karma to Dharma. Dr. Yoshida?
Paradigm shift from karma to dharma. This is a human condition. King Adasa asked the blind man to touch an animal and tell him their findings. Blind man insisted and eventually fighting among them upon their different views because of their touching different parts. This is due to karma, cognitive ceremony, action, habit, and even heredity from our ancestors' karma. The root of karma is kri, grow or create with the body, mouth, and mind. The Buddha said, all beings are karma heirs, including plants, because of genes, as you know. All beings are karma owners, past and present, and often act as karma machines, driven by hormones, etc. But fortunately, he said, we are karma refuge. We can take refuge in good karma, changing bad karma. We are all karma beings, going from human beings to beastly beings or celestial beings, from moment to moment. We can be brutal beasts or benevolent Buddha. Usually, karma causes suffering because it's essentially driven by self-survival instinct. Scientists say selfish genes, which is driven by the three poisons: desire, divisiveness, and fundamentally delusion of self. Because we never experience nirvana beyond karma. We think we have truth, but actually our truths are conventional, mundane truths. So we need another ultimate truth or supramundane truth. Only by reaching nirvana and seeing witnessed by the awakened one, Buddhas, which is the Dharma world. The Buddha explained how our life goes with this most popular dependent origination scheme. This is called becoming wheel. We are like a hamster running on the tread wheel constantly. The driving force is in the center. Formation means past, present, physical, verbal, and mental actions or functions. When we open our eyes, we see the visual world. When we touch a desk, we feel smooth and cold, etc. So the top part tells how our perceptions of consciousness originate upon causes and conditions. This time, name form means sense objects. Six bases means six sense organs: eyes, ears, nose, tongue, body, mind. When they are in contact, we have contact, tactile sense or visual sense, audio sense, etc. When we find it nice, we want more. It's driven by our desire, so the result is suffering. The original word dukkha means wronggoing, going against our wishes. We want more, never satisfied, or even a lot we have, maybe we are too weak to appreciate. The bottom portion tells the subconscious level how we are driven. Unconsciously, we are driven by nescience. Original word avidya is non-witnessing, nirvana, complete peace. So we instantly identify, appropriate this body and mind as ours. So we identify them with me, I, and get involved in becoming hungry, angry, sick, aging, dying. Zen meditation or sitting meditation stills karma and sees the truth dharma and can serve and save all, reaching nirvana. Nirvana means no cessation of karma, karma wind blowing. The process is here in 4 stages. At the first stage, already coarse thinking is gone, but subtle reflection and contemplation is going. Joy, comfort, one-pointedness becomes more dominant. Here, emotions disappear. Covetousness, malevolence, lust, desire, etc. But deeper instinctive or volitions still existent. But at second stage, no more subtle contemplation and investigation, but joy, comfort, one-pointedness only remains. And 4 fluxes or leaks disappear. Lust, becoming, views are strong conviction, beliefs, isms, etc. disappear. And the ultimate nescience, no witness disappear. So towards the end, we are almost to nirvana. Joy disappeared. Only comfort and one-pointedness of mind remains. So we are called equipoised. Next stage, no more sense of self, just equanimity, a pure perception. We are now in nirvana. So anybody can be in nirvana and become awakened. This is a summary of the foregoing. Nirvana, as I said, is same as nivata, nivate padipa, lamplight in no wind, which illuminate the world without flickering flames. Karma is stilled by sitting meditation. Even our emotions, it's like volitions or instinct from the past. We can get into nirvana. There's no self, no fear, no delusion. And there we witness this completely different world and start to see dharmas, norms or laws of all phenomena. Karma is dependent origination upon our action. Nirvana is dependent cessation. Well, we can cease craving and suffering. We can cease nescience and cease resulting samsara, our appropriation and identification of ego, or nationality, or religion. All mental fabrications are gone, and we have pure perception. Just to see only, hear only, etc. Nirvana has 2 kinds, while in life and after death. But after death, we cannot awaken. Too late. Nirvana, as we saw, is no wind of karma blowing us up and down, which is universal. And anyone can pure, free, and here and now, anyone can witness. Dharma is first of all, form, any form of phenomena, truth. Second meaning is norm. Law, ethic. The third meaning is teaching of the Buddha about the norm or law of all phenomena. The dharma of all dharmas, all forms, phenomenon, is called dependent origination or co-origination upon causes and conditions, limitless causes and conditions. When we sit, we become like tree in the garden. The etymological root is dri, enduring, which is same as dharma, holding, form and norm. Tree nature is lasting. Tree can last 10,000 years and harmonious with everything. Universal adaptation, no discrimination or destruction. Freedom is not licentiousness, but Sanskrit cognate priyadhamam means beloved domain. We become familiar, like family members, know well, and act freely without hindrances or disturbances. We can attain freedom first from karma, and then freedom of karma, body and mind. So nirvana has the fruit of free function from all bondages. And then freedom of body and mind and actions. Religion means reunion with holiness. Holiness means wholesome whole or holy, wholesome way and world from sin, separation, sickness, suffering. There are a lot of dharmas. This is in numbers, 1 dharma, 2 dharmas, 3 dharmas, etc. We can just go through a little bit. 1 dharma, as we saw, is a dependent origination. 2 dharmas, we have mundane, supra-mundane truths we have already seen. 3 learnings are learned by all Buddhists. 4 dharma, the very popular, well-known for holy truth, holy, it's not noble, all-inclusive and wholesome, all wholesome, becoming wholesome, which is applicable to all. 5 dharmas, 5 precepts, no killing, no stealing, no lying, and no sexual misconduct. These 4 were employed as a basis for the global ethic. The 4th one changed, reinterpreted into equal partnership between women and men. 6 dharmas, 6 perfections are important among Mahayana Buddhists, Northern Buddhists. 7 dharma, this is precursor of the 8 holy ways. This is for renunciant. 8 holy ways are for anybody, as you see light Oh, I missed livelihood. It's missing here. 9 dharmas, meditations, 4 stages we already saw, plus special samadhis. 10 precepts are no killing, no stealing, no sexual misconduct, etc. This is as physical, verbal, and mental. We have 12 dependent origination or 12 great persons awakening, etc., etc. But I'll finish here. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Yoshida. Next up, we have science. It's Flu, who does research on data mining and computer modeling of air pollution. After a PhD in engineering from Cambridge University, he worked with Dr. Mario Molina at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology on a project to improve the air quality in Mexico City. He now researches air pollution in places ranging from East St. Louis to Tibet and teaches classes on climate change. His topic today is shift from ego to eco. A little bit of a tongue twister there. Dr. Defoe.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation to speak, and thank you, Osamu Yoshida, for the introduction on Buddhist thought and all these concepts. I think about this as an atmospheric scientist. You know, so many things we depend on that we cannot see. I'd like to, at the beginning of talks, just think a little bit, when was the last time we said thank you for our first breath of fresh air in the morning? I've yet to meet somebody who does this as a practice, but how amazing it is that we have oxygen every day, that we, you know, the atmosphere, the earth sort of provides for us. So I wanted to, I was a little, you know, obviously caught off guard, the events the last 10 days, I guess now, with the invasion, the war that we see, the folly of mankind, and sort of coming back to this, when words will not do, what words will we say? That we're in this format of words, and somehow we need to make sure our words sort of come back and you know, impact how we think and how we act, not just in terms of great principles, but also in terms of our immediate action. And one of the things I think I was struck recently, I took a trip to, oh yeah, sorry, this was, yeah, I took a trip to Memphis, where Martin Luther King was assassinated. I'd never been to Memphis before, so it was quite interesting. And to be reminded of what an extraordinary person he was. And then, of course, about just over 2 months ago now, we had Thich Nhat Hanh, who passed away. And what an extraordinary life he led too, and both of them dealing with such immense injustices. Thich Nhat Hanh being a refugee from Vietnam, and the terrible violence that he saw there. And yet both of them really engaged in peacekeeping, really committed to peace in individual people's hearts, and peace as a way of going from that to society. So I want to kind of make a plug for that and say, where, you know, the new Thich Nhat Hanh, the new Martin Luther King, where are you? Make yourself known in the media. We need to hear these voices. And here we have, to come back to this point about nature, we get, I think, sometimes stuck in a lot of debates that may seem academic about, you know, I know in climate change, all this stuff about radiation or carbon dioxide or greenhouse gases. To come back to the basics of just how beautiful, how amazing the earth is, and how we actually do care about it if we stop. You know, we heard about the three sins earlier, the three poisons earlier, but And so here Thich Nhat Hanh says, "It is my conviction that there is no way to peace, but peace is the way." And so many of these formulas seem paradoxical, and that's precisely the point of it, for us to sit with them, to think, and to let them kind of permeate in us. So in, you know, and as we let that permeate with us, then say, well, what do we see? What do we see when we look at the world around us? And I think we've been through this pandemic. Has not been an easy time, has not been a good time. Certainly a lot of the most vulnerable people have been the ones who have suffered the most, like they usually do. Do we take the time to see that? Do we take the time to see the suffering of others? But do we also take the time to see the beauty of the earth as it rotates, that nature keeps going? So earlier in the year, well, last year, earlier in the academic year, we had the big climate change conference in Glasgow in 2021, one of the lessons from an atmospheric scientist. And this was both a disappointing moment, I think, for activists who were hoping for a lot of progress. It was also an encouraging moment on certain ways. I think it was when you hear the reports, journalists who went there, people who went there, the very first time there was a conference where we didn't have to argue about whether climate change is happening. Everybody there was on board. It's like anybody who's paying attention to the sign of the times, anybody who's looking at the data, who's looking at nature knows, okay, this is for real, this is happening. We are damaging the earth, we need to do something about it. So that's the first point from the conference is, okay, we're all now on the same page. The second point was we all have to do something. It's not anymore about, you know, pointing the finger and say, oh no, you have to do something. I get to not change. Everybody is on board with we're together on the planet. We all need to work at this. And of course, different people are going different speeds. It's not going to be smooth sailing. But there were signs of hope there, I think, with what will happen. And there were signs of hope also in side meetings, where even if the main meeting did not have big agreements, the side meetings did have meaningful contributions of smaller groups of countries that said, okay, we can do things. We can do things to reduce methane, which is a big greenhouse gas. We can do those right now. We don't need to wait for everybody. So those are hopeful lessons over the last year from the climate change conference. We also had, just this Monday, the release of a new report from the Ipcc, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, so Climate Change 2022. And so sadly, this was drowned out in the media headlines. So the full report, if you're feeling very patient, then please go ahead and read it. There's 4,000 pages. You may profitably limit yourself to the summary for policymakers, and there's an atlas, and then there's different chapters, different summaries. So go to the website, lots of great things, very nicely laid out. What are the things we can expect? And hopefully we'll be able to get some of those lessons out. You know, the long-term threats that we face from climate change are very, very significant. And we shouldn't let short-term things get in the way of that. But the main thing, the main news, in a sense, from the report is not really news at all. It's that, you know, what climate science has been saying for decades is actually true. Climate change is actually happening. There are hazards, things happening all over the world that we can see. There's more extreme floods, more extreme droughts, more forest fires, a lot of gloom, in a sense, to go around. So that's definitely, in a sense, beyond doubt for anybody of goodwill who wants to really look at what is happening. We can also see vulnerability. And this we saw with the pandemic, we see with war, we see also with nature. We are vulnerable to changes. We are vulnerable to bad things happening. And it's hubris and pride on our part to think that we are not, that we can get away from it. So we're vulnerable, but we are exposed in different ways, and different people. Some people are more exposed to others. So this, in this report, to say, well, we need to sort of come together and say, you know, we need to be caring for everybody in this case. A few of the other sort of I think things that are interesting from the report is to look at compound risks, which is to say when risks multiply, when risks add up to each other. So it's one thing to have a drought. It's then another thing when that drought causes political instability, which causes civil war. We have a compounding of effects that become much worse, and we're seeing that more and more. We have to be careful about maladaptations. So things where we're going to say, oh, we'll have a short-term solution, we will build a wall to prevent the flood. And then what does that make? What does that do? It means that the flood gets even worse the following year, because now we have a wall there to prevent what nature's way is of dealing with the problem. So we have to be careful of maladaptations. And we also need to be careful about, this is the human pride that we can solve it with geoengineering. We'll go in and change the atmosphere. We'll put things up in space to shield the sun. And these usually end up in tears, and they end up in tears in the history of mankind too. So we can look back and say, when man thinks that man can solve all these big problems themselves, it usually does not result in good things. So we saw all of this from the climate change report. There was actually a pretty moving moment during the meeting. There was a final meeting. So there's, I forget how many scientists, there are thousands of scientists from all over the world taking part in these meetings, all on Zoom. And the delegate from Ukraine was on Zoom, even as her city was being shelled, Svetlana Krakowska. She said there is a very direct connection between climate change and the war. Russia has a lot of money from fossil fuels, and these fossil fuels make this war possible. And this, in a sense, this tragedy is something, in a sense, that brings it home for us, that we all have a role in this because we are all using these fossil fuels. The Russian delegates sort of responded by apologizing at great risk, personal risk to themselves. So it was kind of a moving moment for science. In these meetings, people try to be apolitical. They try to be very technical. They can be very dry, difficult to get through. And so this is a moment of humanity, maybe coming back to what Leonora said at the beginning, with look for those moments of people helping, even in crisis. So I think it's worth talking a little bit about this question of fossil fuels, which is central to the climate change problem. Because I didn't feel like I saw enough about it in the news. Hey, I found an article, the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace has this nice map. The spreading instability in oil-producing countries. You can see corruption, conflict, and economic loss since 2008. A lot of places that produce oil and gas do not benefit from oil and gas. I should actually rephrase that. A small number of people benefit from oil and gas. The population at large does not benefit from oil and gas. So in yellow, in green are the countries that manage their oil and gas pretty well. In yellow are countries that have oil and gas, but that do not really seem to benefit the population. In orange, we have countries where there is serious instability as a result of that oil and gas. In red, we have active conflict, and we now see that the biggest orange place should be labeled in red or even in black. This conflict leads to significant loss of the oil industry itself. And so this shows sort of when we let, and I think this goes back to the previous talk, to Samu Yoshida's talk on, when we let this kind of desire get in the way, these poisons get in the way, what does it do? It corrodes our social life. And in this sense, there's total overlap between climate change and political events recently. We've been talking about the Donbass region since 2014, I think, for Westerners who didn't know Ukraine, at least. But until yesterday, I didn't even know that Donbass was an abbreviation for the Donetsk coal basin. Sometimes I kind of scratch my head and say, why are people invading the Donbass region? And shouldn't we have known that it's this major coal producing region? That here, this is a poster from 1921. The Donetsk basin is the heart of Russia, and it kind of shows how limited our view of this whole situation is. How we don't see these pieces of the puzzle. And we're talking about some thought for this talk. I would go a little bit into things that I do not know about, but that I want to kind of bring to people's attention. What would things look like if we did not need to import fossil fuels from corrupt regimes? I mean, climate scientists, environmentalists have been saying this for decades. It would change our whole foreign policy. It would change the way people viewed us, and it would change those countries even probably for the better. The Economist magazine recently had a very nice review of this book, The Economic Weapon of Sanctions, because it seems from the outside that they seem to just strengthen corrupt regimes. I'm not an economist, but I've just, in my life, feel like, this is not working. It's like people on a diet eating, drinking lots of soda somehow. But it comes back to this lesson of atmospheric science. It's hard to go on a crash diet from fossil fuels. When there's a problem in the atmosphere, it's usually the result of long-term accumulation. We saw that with the CFC crisis and the ozone hole. It takes decades for these problems to come up. They creep up on us when we are not looking. And then it's very hard to turn around and immediately reduce things. We could all, turn down our thermostats and drive less and somehow reduce our fossil fuel use pretty drastically so that we could not import or not use as much oil from Russia. We could do that as a personal thing. But it would be easier if we did this gradually with long-term actions through more awareness of the problems we're facing. And to think about, well, how does it impact people? That, not to demonize people. I want to come back here to Martin Luther King. Has a beautiful sermon here, loving your enemies. And some of the things he says, I think, would be very good for us to go back to. And, I sort of analyze yourself. What are the problems that we have done? What is our part of the problem? To go and see the good, in others. A lot of Russians are suffering from this a lot. That hate for hate only intensifies the existence of hate and evil in the universe. What are things we could be doing to promote peace, promote lasting peace? And what could we learn from Martin Luther King and from Thich Nhat Hanh to work on this? There was one thing that really struck me as, one of the things Martin Luther King says, when the opportunity presents itself for you to defeat your enemy, that is the time which you must not do it. And I think there is something in us that seeks revenge and resentment, this bruise, how we fall back on this violence that is in our heart. And he says, don't do it. And he was, I'm in a comfortable position. This does not bite me, but he was not. This was biting for him. There is an eerie parallel with Putin, who grew up, in communist Soviet Union, describing how he would chase rats as a child. They live in a big apartment block, and he would chase the rats around the staircase and cornered a rat, and this rat kind of jumped out and lashed out at him, and it sort of ran away. You can see it. And he kind of says with this kind of knowing look, it's better not to corner anyone. It's a little unsettling, but it's at the same time something we should, I think, be mindful of. Never corner a rat, to make sure there is a way for people out. So as I was preparing for this talk, I came across a nice talk by Wen Stevenson on what to do for climate change, how we could be moving. There's a book that I'm going to go out and look for. What we're fighting now is each other. And so he talks about his Zen master sort of, teaching him, yes, no, don't know. It says, but that's not a call to inaction. That's a call to action, to realize what we don't know, but to become aware of what we need to see, and to show me right here in this moment, you already have the answer. Things are there. And I want to have this. This is a woodcut print from M.C. Escher, with a Japanese poem. This dewdrop world is but a dewdrop world, and yet if we conclude that it's just a dewdrop drill, that nothing matters, but it doesn't. It does matter. That's the and yet there, and there are things we can be doing. And so I do want to, take home message. Everybody can be thinking about their energy use. We can all be reducing our electricity. We can do it through behavioral change, through habits, through the way we live. We can do it through technology. Lots of new technology out there to help us do that. Lots of things to do that are going forward. They're not a going back, or that they're not negative, that they're positive changes. We can think about our transportation, walking and biking. What are the trips we can do, or sharing with others, or being on public transit? Or these are things that bring us in contact with others that have lots of co-benefits. What is our food consumption? The way we eat as a country is kind of out of control. Can we be more mindful of that, our consumption? But also, so don't forget to breathe, walk, and feel, to go out in nature. We're coming up to spring here. To be positive, to see the beauty of nature as something really for us all to care about. So I guess that's what I have today. A little disjointed, I think, because of these events that are kind of weighing on everybody's minds. But we're seeing these three poisons at work: greed, hatred, and ignorance, and how often they elicit that same response within us. Feel like we are going to respond in kind, and to what degree will we meet these three poisons with the six perfections? And lots of different traditions have these things. So I think it's really a message for the whole world. This is why I like the Martin Luther King and Thich Nhat Hanh. We see Buddhists, we see Christians. Everybody in the world can get something from this to move forward. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Devoy. We appreciate so much your words. So next up will be Mr. David Swanson. He's the executive director of World Beyond War. And Mr. Swanson is an author, activist, journalist, and radio host. He is executive director of worldbeyondwar.org and campaign coordinator for rootsaction.org. Swanson's books include War is a Lie. He is a Nobel Peace Prize nominee and a U.S. Peace Prize recipient. His topic is World Beyond War, Shift from War to Peace. Mr. Starr?
Hi, thank you. I hope you can hear me okay. I'm going to try to share screen and see if it works. I hope you can see this. So I'm going to talk a little bit about From War to Peace, when a war is in the news, which makes this an unusual moment. See if I can get to the next slide. Things that we can be doing in this moment related to war and peace. We could be sending aid to Ukrainian friends and aid organizations, to organizations helping refugees leaving Ukraine, to especially those organizations reaching those being refused help for racist reasons. We can also share the remarkable media coverage of war victims in Ukraine and take the opportunity to point out that there are and have always been war victims in Yemen and Syria and Ethiopia and Sudan and Palestine and Afghanistan and Iraq, and they could have been treated as human beings by media coverage as well, and to question whether perhaps the lives of all war victims should matter. And we can take the opportunity to point out that the US government arms most of the world's worst dictators and oppressive governments and would have a lot more funds for humanitarian aid if it didn't. We can also take the opportunity to point out that the proper response to a horrific crime by the Russian government is not the crime of economic sanctions that harm ordinary people, but the prosecution of those responsible in a court of law. Sadly, the US government has spent decades tearing down the International Criminal Court, which has thus far prosecuted only Africans. And if it were to start prosecuting non-Africans and be credible and supported globally, it would have to prosecute quite a few people in the United States and Western Europe. I don't think a proper balance of power is going to save us, but the globalization and universalization of power. Russia is right now violating numerous treaties that the US government regularly violates and is one of the few holdouts on ratifying. This is a chance for us to consider fully supporting the rule of law. We should condemn Russian use of cluster bombs, for example, without pretending, as the US media does, that the United States doesn't use them. The risk of nuclear apocalypse is extremely high. There is nothing more important than avoiding destroying all life on Earth. We can't picture a planet devoid of life and happily think, well, at least we stood up to Putin, or, well, at least we stood up to NATO, or, well, we had principles. Quite apart from where this war goes or where it came from, the US and Russia should be talking right now about taking nuclear weapons out of the calculations, disarming and dismantling them, as well as protecting the nuclear power plants. The news of a couple nights ago, a nuclear reactor on fire in Ukraine and firefighters being shot at. Quite an image of humanity's priorities. The war, so important that you shoot at the people running to put out a fire at a nuclear power plant. 40 years ago, nuclear apocalypse was a top concern. The risk of it is now higher, but the concern is gone. So this is a teaching moment, and we may not have all that many of those left. This could also be a teaching moment about the abolition of war, not just of some of its weapons. It's important for us to understand that almost every war kills, injures, traumatizes, and makes homeless mostly people on one side, mostly civilians, and disproportionately the poor, the elderly, the young, just usually not in Europe. It's important for us to understand that keeping militaries around kills vastly more people than the wars do, and that this will be true until the wars become nuclear. This is because 3% of just US military spending could end starvation on Earth. Militaries divert resources from environmental and human needs, including disease pandemics, as well as preventing global cooperation on pressing emergencies, severely damaging the environment, eroding civil liberties, weakening the rule of law, justifying government secrecy, corroding culture, and fueling bigotry. Historically, the United States has seen an upsurge in racist violence following major wars, as have other countries. Militaries also make those they are supposed to protect less safe rather than more. Where the US builds bases, it gets more wars. Where it blows people up, it gets more enemies. Most wars have US weapons on both sides because it's a business. How do I click to the next one? As we have already heard today, the fossil fuel business is part of what is in play here. The fossil fuels that will kill us all more slowly than a nuclear apocalypse. Germany has now canceled a Russian pipeline and will be destroying the earth with more US fossil fuels. Oil prices are up, so are weapons companies' stocks. Poland is buying billions of dollars worth of US tanks. Ukraine and the rest of Eastern Europe and other members of NATO are all going to be buying a lot more US weapons or having the US buy them as gifts. Slovakia has new US bases. Also up are media ratings, and down is any attention to student debt or education or housing or wages or the environment or retirement or voting rights. We should remember that no crime excuses any other, that blaming anyone doesn't absolve anyone else, and recognize that the solutions now being offered of more weapons and a bigger NATO are also what got us here. Nobody's forced to commit mass murder. The president of Russia and the Russian military elites may perhaps love war and have wanted an excuse for one, but they would not have had that excuse had the perfectly reasonable demands they'd been making been met. When Germany reunited, the US promised Russia no NATO expansion. Many Russians hoped to be part of Europe and NATO, but promises were broken. NATO was expanded. Top US diplomats like George Kennan and people like the current director of the CIA and thousands of smart observers warned that this would lead to war. So did Russia. NATO is a commitment of each member to join in any war that any other member gets in. It's the very madness that created World War I. No country has a right to join it. To join it, any country has to agree to its war pact, and all other members have to agree to include that country and to join in all of its wars. When NATO destroys Afghanistan or Libya, the number of members doesn't make the crime more legal. Trump supposedly opposing NATO doesn't make NATO a good thing. What Trump did was get NATO members to buy more weapons. With enemies like that, NATO doesn't need friends. Ukraine became independent of Russia when the Soviet Union ended and kept Crimea, which Russia had given it. Ukraine was divided ethnically and linguistically, but turning that divide violent took decades of effort by NATO on one side and Russia on the other. Both tried to influence elections, and in 2014, the US helped facilitate a coup. The president fled for his life and a US-backed president came in. Ukraine banned the Russian language in various fora. Nazi elements killed Russian speakers. No, Ukraine is not a Nazi country, but there are Nazis in Ukraine and in Russia and in the United States. That was the context of the vote in Crimea to rejoin Russia. That was the context of the separatist efforts in the East, where both sides have fueled violence and hatred for 8 years. Agreements negotiated, called the Minsk II agreements, provided self-governance for 2 regions, but Ukraine did not comply. The Rand Corporation, an arm of the US military, wrote a report pushing to arm Ukraine to drag Russia into a conflict that would damage Russia and create protests in Russia. A fact that should not stop our support for protests in Russia, but make us careful about what they lead to. Here are the demands that Russia was making for months. President Obama refused to arm Ukraine, predicting it would lead to where we are now. Trump and Biden armed Ukraine, as well as all of Eastern Europe, and Ukraine built up a military on one side of Donbass, with Russia doing the same on the other, and both claiming to be acting defensively. Russia's demands have been to get the missiles and weapons and troops and NATO away from its border. Exactly what the US demanded when the Soviet Union put missiles in Cuba. Exactly what the United States would demand today if there were Russian missiles in Canada. The US refused to meet any such demands. Here again, openly acknowledging the role of fossil fuels in this conflict. Russia had choices other than war. Russia was making a case to the global public, was evacuating people threatened by Ukraine, was mocking the predictions of an invasion on particular days. Russia could have embraced the rule of law and aid. While Russia's military costs only 8% of what the US spends, that's still enough that either Russia or the US could have done all of the following: filled Donbass with unarmed civilian protectors and de-escalators, funded educational programs across the world on the value of cultural diversity in friendships and communities and the abysmal failures of racism, nationalism, and Nazism, filled Ukraine with the world's leading solar, wind, and water energy production facilities, replaced the gas pipeline through Ukraine and never built one north of there with electric infrastructure for Russia and for Western Europe, kicked off a global reverse arms race, joined human rights and disarmament treaties, and joined the International Criminal Court. Ukraine has alternatives right now. People in Ukraine are stopping tanks unarmed, are changing street signs, blocking roads, putting up billboard messages to Russian troops, talking Russian troops out of war. Biden praised these efforts in his State of the Union. We should demand that media outlets cover them. There are many examples in history of nonviolent action defeating coups, occupations, and invasions. If either the United States or Russia had tried for years not to win Ukraine to its camp, but to train Ukrainians in non-cooperation, Ukraine would be impossible to occupy. So we have to stop saying, I'm against all war, except this one, every time there's a new war. We have to support alternatives to war. We have to start spotting propaganda. We have to stop obsessing over the few foreign dictators that the United States government doesn't fund or arm. We can join in solidarity with courageous peace activists in Russia and in Ukraine. We can seek out ways to volunteer for nonviolent resistance in Ukraine. We can support groups like Nonviolent Peace Force that have for years had greater successes unarmed than do armed UN troops we call peacekeepers. We can tell the US government that there is no such thing as lethal aid, and that we insist on actual aid and serious diplomacy and an end to NATO expansion. We can demand that with the US media now suddenly liking peace demonstrations, it covers some in the United States and includes some anti-war voices in the media. We can turn out at events tomorrow and in the coming days to demand Russia out of Ukraine and NATO out of existence. We can do local peace activism, which achieves successes much more rapidly than national or global peace activism, builds community, builds alliances with people not always focused on peace, shows people the impact of militarism on their lives. We can do nonviolent activism locally. We can demand that US corporate media celebrate nonviolent activism as if it were in Russia. We can build endurance among people who depend on winning victories to go on to work for larger victories. And we can make our local efforts part of global efforts by working together and learning from and teaching those doing similar things in other places. And we can work globally, which can be more effective than nationally, especially when you are in the most militarized society the world has. We can take on the global business of militarism by joining with people, for example, in the locations where bases are being built, as well as the places that are building the bases far from their homes. We can direct our resources and our solidarity where they are most useful. For example, right now in Ukraine, we can work to close bases, to cut off funding, to prevent wars, to end weapon sales, and make these steps explicitly part of the longer campaign of abolition of war. We can do education as well as activism. At worldbeyondwar.org, you can find online book clubs and lengthy, in-depth online courses, as well as webinars, articles, videos, photos, etc. We can learn how to oppose war as the problem, rather than a particular side of a war as the problem. And we can develop an understanding of what a world beyond war looks like economically, culturally, governmentally, in all of the systems that regulate our lives. To quote Martin Luther King, who has appeared in this event already, we are now faced with the fact that tomorrow is today. We are confronted with the fierce urgency of now. Perhaps we have been for a while. In this unfolding conundrum of life and history, there is such a thing as being too late. There is no time for apathy or complacency. This is a time for vigorous and positive action. Martin Luther King, Jr. See if I can stop sharing. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I like your little owl in the back with the mask on. That's that's a good message there in the background as well. Thank you so much.
I don't have mine on. Yes.
What?
Thank you.
Well, the owl has his on, so it's okay. Thank you. That was a really amazing talk. Thank you for all the information to help us take action to end wars. Okay, so next up we have Mr. Stephen Starr from the University of Missouri at Columbia. Mr. Starr started out as a student of nuclear engineering, but came to realize that he didn't want to make weapons for a living. That's a right livelihood there. He has published papers on abolishing nuclear weapons and has traveled to give talks on climate change related to nuclear disaster. He has addressed a panel on the United Nations and the consequences of nuclear war, on the climate change consequences of a nuclear war. His topic is Shift from Nukes to Life.
Hello, thank you for having me here today, and I enjoyed David's presentation. It's actually a good lead into what I was going to say. Let's see if I can share my screen here. I was going to show what would happen. This is a video that the French made after it shows the dispersion of radioactive material after the Chernobyl plant blew up and burned for almost 3 weeks. And we were looking at the news about the largest reactor in Europe at Zaporizhzhia, and the reporting here was that the Russians had shelled it, and so I want to say that I think truth is, they say truth is the first casualty of war, although I think maybe these days it doesn't take a war for it to be a casualty. And I actually don't really trust many governments, to tell the truth. And David pointed out some of I was glad he posted the demands that Russia, they put forward 2 draft treaties in December 17th, and he listed some of they were demands really, but they were articles in the treaties that they wanted. And he also discussed the expansion of NATO to Russian borders. So I thought I'd mention a few things about that. The U.S. has put missile bases. They're supposed to be interceptor bases in Romania and Poland on the Russian border. They have this Aegis Ashore launching system that they also have on the ships that are out at sea. But these the launching systems they use are dual use, and they can also be used to launch Tomahawk cruise missiles. The missiles arrive in closed containers, so it's impossible to verify what's loaded into them. And the U.S. is in the process also of putting a newer version of the interceptor missile. It's a SM-6. It goes 3.5 times the speed of sound. So the Russians are concerned that these missiles could be used offensively, and that it would hit Moscow in about 5 to 6 minutes if they put a nuclear warhead on an SM-6. So that was one of their demands, that the U.S. would remove these bases. They also demanded the U.S. remove its nuclear weapons from the 5 countries that we have them in NATO. So we've based, and that's actually, the nuclear weapons have been in Europe for a long time, but essentially the Russians were, if Russia put missile launching bases on our Canadian or Mexican border, I think we would probably be upset about that too. Sorry, I mean to go on with that, but I think what I wanted to get to basically was the fact that we don't hear all the news. That the Russian artillery, if they would have shelled that reactor, it would have destroyed it, and we would have seen that all that radiation you saw spreading, it contained cesium-137, and it made a lot of those lands uninhabitable. I'll show you a map in a minute. This is this is a cooling tower of 1 reactor. There's 6 reactors at Zaporizhzhia. This is a map of the, so in other words, but what I was trying to say about the news was that I don't think the Russians did shell it. I think there was some kind of fight there. But the Russians are very well aware of what destroying a nuclear reactor means, just based on what happened in 1986 when the Chernobyl nuclear reactor blew up. This map shows the areas that were, seriously contaminated. There are either radiation control zones, the really dark red areas are radiation exclusion zones, where nobody can live for centuries. The primary contaminant in a fallout from a reactor accident is cesium-137, because it's the second most volatile element after mercury. So it becomes a vapor. It's vaporized inside the fuel rods by the time they heat up enough to melt down and rupture, and it goes up into the air. And it's in the same family as potassium, which is a macronutrient. So it gets recycled in plants and ecosystems, and it causes all kinds of human problems. There's a thing called Chernobyl heart. But at any rate, so I don't think the Russians would have shelled that. And one other thing I just want to mention about what we haven't heard in our news, because I'd suggest you to go outside the regular mainstream media and try to look for other places to get your information about what's going on in the world. And it's kind of harder these days. Maybe it's even going to get harder if we're going to cut off all the information sources. But there was over the last 8 years, from 2014 to 2022, it was Benjamin mentioned Donbass earlier. The people that lived there, they were in the separatist republics that, they didn't want to be part of the government they didn't want to be governed by the coup that took place that David mentioned in 2014. And the Ukrainian army routinely shelled them for 8 years, artillery and sniping. 18,000 civilians were killed and wounded in the last 8 years there. And we didn't hear anything about that in our news. And so there's reasons why a lot of those people are, about a third of them are ethnic Russians. And so I don't think anybody's in the right in a war like this, but there are reasons why Russia, I think it was terrible that they invaded. I think they lied about it, but there were reasons why they did it. And that part of it was things we haven't heard about. So anyway, I don't want to talk too much, but it's hard not to talk about current events. But I wanted to give you an idea about the toxicity of the radiation. So on this map, before I change it, the key down here, it tells you how much cesium-137 there is per square kilometer that makes it uninhabitable. And when it comes down to it, it's actually less than 0.5 gram per square kilometer, or 1.2 grams per square mile. So that's a dime weighs 2.7 grams. If you, and I made an image here. If you took a dime and vaporized it, if it was the equivalent of cesium-137, and you spread it equally across Central Park, you wouldn't be able to go there for a couple centuries. At least it wouldn't be safe to live there. So that's how toxic this stuff is. And it's dangerous at the molecular level. That's part of the reason why I didn't go into nuclear engineering too. I didn't like the radiation. I don't think we should make any product through, any industry shouldn't make a poison that lasts for centuries and that can kill people at the molecular level. And just to show you here, this shows you the location of all the different fallout, all the nuclear plants in the United States and Europe. If they shoot off a nuclear weapon above the atmosphere, it creates what they call an electromagnetic pulse, which will basically destroy the integrated circuits in all modern electronics over a really large area, at least an area of larger than the state of Missouri, probably more than that. And that would destroy all the emergency cooling systems at any nuclear power plants that it hit. So they would basically all wind up melting down. I'm just finishing like a book on it right now. So that's nuclear power. Nuclear power is very much related to nuclear weapons because plutonium is manufactured in the fuel in a nuclear reactor when it's bombarded. You have typically uranium fuel, and when it is fissioned in the reactor core, part of what's the uranium actually picks up a neutron and becomes plutonium. And there's plutonium-239 and 240. You can make a reactor specifically to make the 239. Like North Korea did, but even reactor grade plutonium is what they call weapons usable. And Ukraine has about 50 tons of plutonium in its spent fuel at its different reactors. So when Putin said that Ukraine has the ability to make nuclear weapons, he wasn't really lying. They have the material there and the technique, the ability to do it. So Russia lost 27 million people killed in World War II. and by the Nazis, and they're very acutely aware of when a neo-Nazi government announces that they're going to make nuclear weapons. This is the number of nuclear warheads there are basically in the different nuclear weapon states. And, you know, Russia and the United States have the most, let's see, I've got I'll switch just quickly. I've got a website, if I can, let's see, that's not the right. Yeah, so I have a website called Nuclear Famine, and I list the number of, I got it from there. This also shows that the warhead inventories, the US and Russia have, they have more than 90% of all the nuclear weapons in the world. So, you know, nuclear disarmament really needs to start with us. Let's see, what did I do here? Computers are always challenging. Okay, so remember Hiroshima. I mean, this was what the city looked like before the bomb went off, and this was after. Atomic bomb is, most of the nuclear weapons that the US and Russia have are somewhere between 7 and 80 times more powerful than these. I made a graphic to show what the fire, they call it a firestorm. A nuclear weapon's kind of like a piece of the sun. It burns hotter than the sun does, just for a brief moment, but that's when you do that within the atmosphere of the earth, it can ignite, you know, giant fires, what they call a firestorm. It'll ignite fires over a large area simultaneously, and then they kind of join together to form a gigantic, what they call a mass fire or a firestorm. Hiroshima was a 15 kiloton, that means 15,000 tons of TNT explosive equivalent. It created a fire zone of about 3 to 5 square miles. This, I overlaid this. This is New York City, the map. Now this on the right is a thermonuclear strategic bomb. That's Russia has probably, I don't know, 800 of these. And this was what, and they're 800 kilotons is a standard warhead size. So the firestorm would cover 90 to 150 square miles instead of 3 to 5. So it just shows you the power of these weapons. Nations like India and Pakistan, when you call it an emerging nuclear weapon state, they basically, their first weapons they developed historically have been like atomic bombs, but they have quite a few of them now. And the scientists that I work with did studies that predicted that what happens is the firestorms are so intense, they burn everything basically that's flammable. And if you had a war with India and Pakistan where about 100 of these weapons were detonated in total, 50 in India and 50 in Pakistan in the large cities. This graphic shows how the smoke would rise up and spread, and within about 2 or 3 weeks, it forms a stratospheric smoke layer that would block something like 7 to 10% of the sunlight from reaching the surface of the earth. So after that, the skies would become gray basically in the northern hemisphere. This was kind of what a normal sky would look like on a cloudless day. And that would be enough to cause the coldest weather in the last, average weather conditions in the last 1,000 years. So it would probably create a large amount of famine, because you wouldn't be able to grow wheat in Canada, for example. It'd be too cold. The last time we had a weather event like that, it was let's see, when was that? Tambura erupted in 1811, and the next year they call it the year without summer. And we had, like in the United States, we had killing frost every month of the year. So that's kind of, you know, this would be worse. So then I just thought I'd show a picture that the Russian and American presidents are always accompanied by a military officer that has, they call it the nuclear briefcase. It's basically an automatic control device that allows them to issue a permission order to start a nuclear attack, be one weapon or a full-scale war. So that's, you know, when they say, oh, there's no danger, it's sort of a lie, I think, because they have to make it so that the orders can be given, you know, like in a matter of less than a minute. So that's, I've written about that. So this is after the U.S.-Russian war with thousands of nuclear weapons. instead of 5 million tons of smoke, you'd have 150 million tons of smoke entering the stratosphere. And that's when what they would create what they called nuclear winter. And that was first described in the early 80s. And then they redid the studies in around 2006, 7, and 8 and found that they actually underestimated the effects early on. So this would be so cold that would create below freezing temperatures every day for 1 to 3 years in central US and Eurasia. It would basically be too cold to grow food crops for about 10 years. And that's what I've basically been trying to write about for the last, I don't know, 15 years. It seems important to me. We have an event that's happened in the past when an asteroid hit the Earth. I don't know, it's like 60 million years ago. That's when the dinosaurs, they believe, were killed, and it threw all the matter up into the above the Earth, and then when it came down to the stratosphere, it actually heated the atmosphere to about 2,700 degrees, and it also it killed all the dinosaurs. It also basically set all the forests on fire in the world, and they call that impact. That was a lot more smoke than a nuclear war would create, but it would be so dark that you wouldn't be able to see your hand in front of your face. That's why I think about 70% of the species on Earth perished at that time. Anyway, this is about what the sky would look like after a U.S. Russian nuclear war within, about a year later. So that's why we can't let this happen. And but I want to say that, people have become more and more aware of this in the last decade or so. And because of this, there was a treaty that was passed. It's called the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, but it's called the Ban Treaty. That's what the short name is. But it's gone into force now. The nuclear weapon states have refused to sign it. But part of the reason it was passed is because in the hearings that they had before, some of the scientists that did those studies came and presented their information, and people began to understand that it wasn't just the target nations that were going to be affected in a nuclear war, because the U.S. and Russia, some of the nations in the southern hemisphere, almost be glad to see us go after all the trouble we've caused for them. But now they realize that they can't allow that to happen either. So, and I think the important thing about the treaty, that it's been belittled, but it creates a moral stigma against the possession or the manufacture, the threat of use. You can't develop, test, produce, stockpile, station. You can't transfer nuclear weapons. The U.S. is actually in violation of the Non-Proliferation Treaty by keeping nuclear weapons at 5 NATO bases in Europe, which is one of the things that Russia asked us to get rid of. We say we're not, because they won't get those unless a war starts. But we train their military to use it, and then they have to buy weapon systems that can, like the F-35, that can carry them. So anyway, I do think it's important. It's like the chemical weapons and the biological weapons treaties, that it creates a moral standard against nuclear weapons. And I think that's a good place to point to when you're arguing against nuclear weapons. So I hope I haven't talked too long, but and I'd be glad to answer any questions that y'all have.
Thank you, Mr. Starr. Yeah, if you are able to stick around for just a little bit longer, then
Oh, sure.
we have the panel discussion.
Yeah.
Yes, then we'll appreciate if you're available for questions. So our last speaker today is, of course, Dr. Kongsak Tanpachir, and he is the chairman of the Buddhist Council of Greater St. Louis, and he's a member of the Thai Buddhist Temple in Florissant, Wat Prasi Ratananam, where he teaches meditation and mindfulness, and he's written multiple books and articles on Buddhism. So we are happy to hear his topic today, which is shift from sickness to health. Dr. Kongsak.
Thank you for the introduction. When we talk about a paradigm or models or norms, in Buddhism, we see the nature of the living world into the 5 model or 5 orderliness. First is a physical law. Second is a biological law, like a genome, genetics. Third is a psychic law, mind, and then fourth is the karma, a moral law. action and consequence. And the fifth one is Dharma law. It's about cause and effect. So when Julie Payette, chief Canadian astronaut, was in the Discovery shuttle, she noticed that Earth is one entity, and you realize that's the only thing we have. You see very thin layer. It's about 35 kilometers thick. And below that's life, and above there's nothing. It's a vacuum. And His Holiness, he was talking about stratosphere in the picture there, that have ozone layer and protect us from UV light and skin cancer and all that. And also where the CO2 and CFC going up to. His Holiness say the whole humanity is one human family. It's only home that we have. We all share this planet Earth. We have to learn to live in harmony and peace with each other and with nature. It's not just a dream, it's a necessity. It's look like I have trouble with the advancement. Sorry about that. So again. So basically, we are seeing temperature rising since World War II, 1945, and up to now, we are at 1.3 centimeter above that level. And hopefully by the end of this decade, we're not reaching 1.5 if we try to get rid of the CO2 accumulation. Basically, we are carbon-based organism, plant and human, or animals. So we have fossil carbon when we decay, decompose, and we also generate more CO2 that we breathe in. And also, plant does have carbon capture, it's carbon sink, and put out oxygen instead. And we also have human emission through our using fossil fuel and so on, which has been awarded Nobel Prize on October 5th last year to Dr. Manabe and also Hesselman of Princeton and Max Planck Institute about human was causing rising of temperature. And basically CO2 keep rising, and currently it's about 420 parts per million, and we try to keep it down into the future. About half in the atmosphere, 1/4 in the ocean, and 1/4 in the carbon sink in the plants. And we're using fossil and generate more CO2. And deforestation and logging, we're losing carbon sink. Also with agriculture and raising cattle for meat and so on. But with the chemical reaction, plus or minus, we end up with at least 18 million tons of methane in the atmosphere each year. And permafrost is melting, so you can light the fire from that methane and spit out. So Earth is quite sick. It's bubbling up this methane. And methane is even worse than CO2 by 30 times. In the oxygen poor condition, it generates methane, like decomposition. Oxygen rich, it generates CO2. And we have like the Arctic giant sinkhole from the burst of this CO2. And turn out we have at least much more in there, up to 1.3 trillion tons of methane in about a mile deep down in the earth. So look, I have some trouble using the PowerPoint. So we can try to turn it back by, like Bhutan is a good example. They produce more oxygen than they consume, and they generate 2.2 million tons of CO2 each year, but their forests absorb 3 times this amount. It creates a carbon sink, but Bhutan is 7% forest. So it's kind of might not be applicable to everyone. And we should try to convert using solar energy whenever possible, wind energy. So renewable energy may be the alternate into the future, hydroelectric power, electric car into the future. So it might reverse this feedback loop. The second part is organic disorder, biological law, like a genetic factor. So back in year 2000, Human Genome Project was completed. 2005 Chimpanzee Project was completed. And we found out we were very close to the apes, 98.7% similar to chimpanzee. We are all 99.9% similar to with our genome to each other. Basically, we are always in deep difference. And we all share ATCG, adenine, thymine, cytosine, guanine. And we share 95% with the dog, with the roundworm, 74%, banana, 50%, daffodil, 35%, with rice and wheat, 24%. And animal now, especially ape, know how to use tools. Human invent tools and weapons. We can create concrete jungle at Central Park and also destroy each other and apply tool as weapon at 9/11. The Buddha stated that Buddhism subscribes to craving concepts for pleasure and pain. And we also, but he said, we are but companions of birth, aging, sickness, and death with no exception. When Columbus landed in Haiti in 1492, within 25 years, 95% of the native population died out, was wiped out, not by weapon, but by infectious disease, with old world, malaria, typhus, influenza, smallpox, and other viruses. And our Earth has 8.7 million species, that with exploitation, overfishing, invasive species like the sea urchin eating up those quail, and also climate change and pollution. That's why we invade the animals' habitat. We're losing 150 species today. Of those that left there, they only have 50% less habitat space. And with the world trading and hunting, as well as traveling, we come to exposed to animal vector and maybe exposed to virulent virus. And this has been the case in pandemic COVID-19. In the end of 2019, we have this COVID virus. SARS-CoV-2 would have a protein spike, and we use the mRNA to make the vaccine from the spike protein. On the spike protein, they can attack the S2 receptor, invade type 2 pneumocystis in the lung and endothelial cells of the pulmonary vasculature, cause severe lung damage and cytokine storm. You also lose smell and taste, as well as GI symptoms with nausea, diarrhea, vomiting, sometimes get cardiomyopathy and so on. And the role of controlling pandemic is to test and treat, like President Biden say, on the spot. We can give antivirus to this COVID-19 virus, COVID-2, SARS-CoV-2, and prevent by vaccination. It turned out like we have prevention is the best treatment, and 80% of the Americans were vaccinated, at least one dose, but unvaccinated 17 times more to have problem with it, being infected, and 15 times more to die. But at least 60 million Americans would remain unvaccinated. It's very hard to change their opinion. They don't believe in this science and so on. At least in this past 2 years, we have new science discovered more cytokine treatment on the top bar there. And on the bottom bar is many monoclonal antibodies, but this may not be working with the new variant like Omicron, because it varies. It's turned with the more mutant. And Paxlovid is the one that on the far right, that President Biden stated on the State of the Union that will be given on the spot if you have positive COVID test. So we are at least on the fourth spike of the pandemic. That's Omicron. It has 26 unique spike mutation in this last virus. And within 3 months since Halloween to the end of January, it's all converted from Delta to Omicron. It's been shown here, unvaccinated people are very susceptible to infection, especially Omicron, not only to Delta, much more with Omicron. And vaccinated people in the dotted line would have partial protection. If you have booster, you have a better chance to protect yourself with it. Unvaccinated people, if you're admitted to the hospital, you have 97 times more likely to die from Omicron. And here show the vaccination to the COVID vaccine. Start with 81% with Omicron because it's a new mutant. And it dropped at 6 months to 57%. If you have booster, go up to 90%. Currently, this last week, is almost 1 million died from this disease in the United States. Worldwide, almost 6 million died from COVID-19. Luckily, end of January, we start dropping off the curve on the Omicron. This is from New York City, about 2/3 dropping from hospitalization. At least 300 cases in Missouri today, so being admitted to the hospital. So we have this wearing masks, which is a sign of love, kindness, compassion. Protect others as well as yourself. The term Omicron is 70 times multiplied 70 times faster in the bronchial tree and the nasal mucosa. So it can infect very easily at the lower dose. And there were about 800,000 cases a day in the mid-January and over 2,000 deaths a day. So cloth masks become ineffective against Omicron because it's so infectious. Surgical masks may protect you about 20 minutes, N95 protect you for 2 hours. So mask mandate is being lifted and become a lawsuit issue, so become political issue. But the head of CDC is still wearing masks, okay? Don't give up. And CDC come up with the guideline, maybe COVID community risk area, maybe guideline, low and medium area, yellow and green, you may lift the mask mandate in those areas, but at your risk. So COVID-19 has been cause of death, third highest cause of death, and lowered our life expectation by about a few years already. And we also in bad debt at least 9 trillion during the President Trump's era. And with President Biden at 2.2 trillion, we had 30 trillion in debt currently. And you know who will be paying for that? Your children, grandchildren, and so on. So third in Buddhism is psychic law. We're under constant stress nowadays, multitasking. with lower productivity overall, more mistake, burnout, switching between this task and that task. So constantly connecting, so you can't zero out what is important. So turn out mindfulness meditation is very effective in de-stressing people with great success. So Fortune 500 company adopt mindfulness meditation.
Your slides are not moving.
Oh, really? Mine is moving all the time.
No, we don't see.
Okay, let me do that again.
Thank you.
Please tell me again if there's some problem. I want to know it.
Okay.
See where we are. Are you sharing screen with me now? I don't know.
We show your screen.
You see this slide? 15
Yes.
proven mindfulness benefit.
Yes.
Okay. So MBSR mindfulness-based stress reduction has been shown to control temper, fend off depression, reduce worry, anxiety, set up boundary to say no, lose weight, lower daily stress, fall asleep faster, and increase focus and concentration, be a better listener, enjoy sex more, lower blood pressure, be more assertive, even your spiritual life, stick with your goal, and be a better leader. The fourth is the karma law, moral law. The Buddha stated, mind is luminous, but tainted with transitory mental impurities of greed-headed delusion. Transitory means it's not the true nature of mind. You invited it in. So I declare volition or will or decision is karma or action. Having will, one acts by body, speech, and thoughts. We are what we think. What we are arises with our thoughts, and with our thoughts we make our world. And you see what happened on January 6, 2021 with the riot, and now with Ukraine, invasion by Russia, all based on craving and concepts of bias. We have root of bias is basically caused by your own greed, hatred, delusion, or your ego or stupidity, and by fear of concept of misinformation, something invisible like a COVID, SARS-CoV-2. Buddha described personal freedom, value spiritual and intellectual freedom over physical and social freedom. And there's true freedom and ultimate freedom. And personal freedom is based on this true ultimate freedom. I mean, you void of greed, hatred, delusion, and achievable by anyone by practicing awakening qualities of Bodhipakkaya Dharma. So from 4 foundations of mindfulness up to Noble Eightfold Path, and we live a wholesome life, observe basic precepts, no killing, no stealing, no sexual misconduct, no lying, no intoxicant. Also practicing loving kindness, compassion, altruistic joy, and equanimity. The fifth in the norm, orderless of nature is the Dharma law, cause and effect. Einstein stated that our situation on this earth seems strange. Everyone came here involuntarily and uninvited for a short stay without knowing why. To me, it's enough to wonder at the secrets. But the Buddha disapproved about the concept of such teaching that person experienced pleasure, pain, or neither pleasure and pain without cause and without conditioning. And also disapproved that this is caused by Supreme Being's action of creation, caused by what is done in the past of fixed fate. That he said he discovered through his enlightenment and taught dependent arising, origination, law of causation, that one is capable of control one's own fate in that regard, plus the end of suffering, nirvana, basically is his enlightenment. And that is taught. So basically, we start with avijja, ignorance. We generate your thought conditioning, mental impulse, tainted your mental consciousness, causing imagination. Six sense spheres corrupted, eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, and mind corrupted. Contact, feeling, craving, clinging, all corrupted. Becoming your biased thoughts, birth to your biased thought, aging, ripening of your biased thoughts, and the thought died down. You have grief, sorrow, lamentation, and start with another cycle again. With unawareness, you keep this running, deep in arising. But awareness, you break the cycle, and you can end with nirvana. The Buddha called the world or the realm that you are generated. He said, you declare the world, which basically the Four Noble Truths of suffering, cause of the world, end of the world, and path to end the world, middle path. In this body, 6 foot tall, 1 foot wide, equipped with perception and consciousness. So we generate this thing. And basically we generate self-image hologram, we call it imagination or nama-rupa. And we create our world, becoming our realm, and birth into that realm, your thoughts, the deep thoughts into such realm. But he also taught that each person, in youth there's aging, in health there's illness, in life there's death. Even though you condemn aging, you still have, you still destroy such beauty anyway with aging. And even though you may live 100 years, you cannot escape death. Death would crush all lives without exception. Basically, he was talking apoptosis that was discovered about 30 years ago. Programmed cell death. Every cell is programmed to die at a certain age. In life, there's death. And it's been shown like in health and disease and illness, we're exposed to environmental infections, pollens, allergens, sometimes the water infection or the allergen. Sometimes we overproduce, cause allergies. And we have troops of white cells to protect you from infection. We have innate immunity and produce antibodies to T and B lymphocytes or cellular immunity and get ward off infection. And in healthy cells, there's a rate of DNA damage 500,000 times in the DNA modification events per cell per day. You see how many. And if the rate of damage equal to rate of repair, you stay healthy in the either nuclear DNA or mitochondrial DNA. If the diseased cells, the rate of DNA damage is over the rate of repair in a pathology with cancers, getting old senescence, and apoptosis, cell die. So sickness and death, the Buddha said, health or no sickness is the great fortune. Happiness is the ultimate fortune, it's the ultimate wealth. Trusted friend is the best relatives, and nirvana is ultimate bliss. So we faced with this, the true nature of all things is universal characteristics of impermanence, imperfection, selflessness. Physically, you can see the change from infant, toddler, a young age, middle age, old age, and die. And physically and mentally, it's harder to see. That thing basically is selfless in nature. It's a temporary self that you generate when you're exposed to any nature. And true nature of the body and mind is selfless in nature, no true permanent selves. So he taught that to see, just see, to hear, just hear. Perceive, just perceive through the six sense organ, eye, ears, nose, tongue, body, and mind. And to realize it, but sight, sound, smell, taste, touch, and thoughts without bias. You should practice like that, then the so-called you will no longer exist. That's the Fourth Noble Truth. When you don't exist in this realm, you won't exist in next realm or between those realms. And that's the end of suffering. And that disciple attained full enlightenment. This is a shortcut to the Heart Sutra, basically, the Third Noble Truth. So the Buddha said, all being has Buddha nature. Buddha sees within yourself. When you practice mindful awareness unbiasedly, with the middle path, you can gain insight wisdom. All beings are similar to the Buddha. All beings are the Buddha. So a lotus for you, a sign of enlightenment, a Buddha to be. And that's the end of my talk. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Kongsak. Thank you very much. So now we will open up the floor to all of the attendees and start a Q&A session with our speakers. So if you can unmute yourself and ask a question of any of the presenters, or just to have a question out there, if there's a specific presenter you want to ask, or if you just would like to present a question to anyone available to answer. Or if you want to send a question in the chat, then I can also just read the question.
Can I say something?
Yes, go ahead.
Well, one thing I realized I should have said in my talk when I had that map of the contaminated zone of Chernobyl, and I was talking about the cesium-137 that had been released. The main reason I was what I was trying to get to is that they call it a spent fuel pool. And what that means is a spent fuel is nuclear fuel that's been used in the reactor. It only stays in the reactor. It stays in the reactor core for about 3 years before it's removed. When it goes in, it's not very radioactive at all. You can hold it in your hand, but when it comes out, if you were within 2 or 3 feet of it, it would kill you in a matter of seconds. So and that amount of radiation generates a huge amount of heat. So they have to put it underwater. They transfer it underwater and keep it in the pool for at least 6 years, although sometimes longer, depending. But each spent fuel pool in the United States has between like 900 and 1,200 pounds of plutonium that are within the spent fuel rods. And so when you consider it takes 1.2 grams to make a square mile uninhabitable, each one of these pools, and I'm sure that the reactors in Ukraine probably have similar amounts. I did see a photo of the one there at Zaporizhzhia where they have the 6 reactors that we had the news about. You can also, after the fuel's in the pool long enough, you can take it out and then you put it into these large stainless steel casts, and then you put those inside of concrete. And that's safer to store it that way than in the pool. But if you hit that with an explosive, it'll release the radiation too. So anyway, nuclear power plants have always, the nuclear industry has always avoided the topic of the danger that these plants represent during wartime. And for example, in Japan, they have a lot of nuclear power plants on the West Coast. And if North Korea hit some of those, even with a conventional warhead, and destroyed the reactors, the radiation would probably make most of Japan uninhabitable. So that's part of the reason I decided I didn't want to go into nuclear engineering too. At that time, there were a lot of opportunities in making weapons, and I wasn't interested in that either. But so anyway, I wanted to make that point about the toxicity, that how much cesium-137 there is. But when uranium breaks in half, it makes typically about half of it becomes either cesium-137 or strontium-90. Strontium's in the same family as calcium, and that gets into your bones and teeth. And the cesium gets into your muscles and soft tissues. So anyway, I'll go on too long, but I thank you for letting me make that point.
So Mr. Starr, while we still have you up, perhaps I can ask, as you mentioned about getting your news from various sources.
Yeah.
So what do you, it was really bewildering when I saw the news that the Russians went and seized Chernobyl, the plant over there. So what do you think is their intention? I mean, it just sounds so odd. What do you think?
I think that they were, so if you look at the map, Chernobyl was actually on the way to Kiev. So it's, in terms of the invasion, it sort of made sense. And there's areas there where they could leave military vehicles. It's kind of a wide open place because it's uninhabitable, there. But like I said before, you know, and I'm sure some people would totally disagree with me, but I think Russia had a terrible experience, just as Ukraine and Belarus did from Chernobyl. And they don't want to see any of those reactors there destroyed, regardless of whatever their intentions are in Ukraine. The news that we get, I'll give you my opinion, but I think a lot of the news we get, our news sources get it primarily from Ukrainian sources right now. And Ukraine they're going to lose the war. They're in the process of losing. The Russians are, they're certainly going to wind up taking over the country. So the Ukrainians are desperate, and they're issuing a lot of news stories that may or may not be true. But, you know, each side, the Russians are probably releasing stories that aren't true too. So I don't trust either source. But just in terms of common sense, you know, and I know, you know, they said that it had been shelled by artillery, so in Zaporizhzhia. And if you look at what heavy artillery Russia has, if they shelled anything like a nuclear power plant, it would be blown to smithereens. So that didn't make sense to me at all. And there were no radiation spikes that I heard about. There apparently that you can, and around Chernobyl, it's so radioactive from, you know, all the forests died around there from the fallout, and got into the soil and the plants. And just, you know, driving a lot of, you know, soldiers through there, you can raise up dust. And if you had a forest fire, that releases a lot of radiation. So that's the problem when you have a reactor that gets destroyed. All the radiation becomes ubiquitous in the environment, and it's just hard to deal with. At Fukushima, the Japanese scrape a lot of soil up and put it in big containers. And but the problem is, if it's in the forests and the trees and, you know, other places besides the city, the wind will blow it back in. So it's, anyway, I'm not a big fan of nuclear power. They say it's safe and clean, but I just don't, you know, the radiation is what, you know, where I don't agree with that part.
Okay, thank you, because yeah, I just thought that was really bewildering, and I couldn't see a point for them to seize that. And
Yeah.
but I don't know.
Well, the
Yeah.
Russians would say, well, we're afraid the Ukrainians are going to sabotage it. Each side's going to have a story, but I don't, you know, anybody in their right mind doesn't want to blow up a nuclear power plant. And they're hard, you know, you can't just turn one off. And it's a very technical thing. When you turn off a reactor, even if you have an emergency shutdown, it stops the fission process, but the radiation in the reactor core still is intense enough that the fission products there generate about 7% of the total heat. And those, like a 1,000 megawatt reactor has 3,000 megawatts of heat. That means 3 million watts of heat. And 7% of that still remaining immediately is like 200 or 300 watts of heat. The reactor core is like 16 feet tall, maybe, and 12 feet wide. So that's a huge amount of heat in a small area. They normally, when a reactor is running, they run a couple 100,000 gallons of water through the reactor core per minute. So the emergency, when an emergency shutdown happens, the emergency cooling systems have to come on within 3 seconds. You know, they got to get this water going through there again. The heat will die down pretty quickly. Within an hour, instead of 7%, they'll be down to 1 or 2%. But, you know, the reason I've been writing this book about electromagnetic pulse is that I'm really convinced that, you know, if somebody shoots a nuclear weapon off up in a 40 to 60 miles up, it can generate these huge electromagnetic fields that will destroy all these integrated circuits that are within the emergency power system and within all the different motors and the circuits and the pumps and the relays and the sensors that are in a reactor. And they'll disable the emergency power and cooling systems to the point where they won't function. And that just means that it's a given that the reactor core is going to melt down within an hour or so. And, you know, if you shot one off over France, you could melt down 50 reactors at the same time. So I've been told, so a lot of people, they say, well, we don't worry about that because if somebody shoots a nuclear weapon off, it's going to be a nuclear war and it won't matter anyway. But I don't agree with that. And I also think that if people, you know, the nuclear weapon states, people understand some of this about electromagnetic pulse, they might just shoot one weapon off. It'll also destroy our electric grid too, because it destroys all the large power transformers that are required for long distance transmission of electricity. Part of the reason I'm writing it is because there are technical solutions. They can actually spend money to protect the transformers and they can reduce the amount of electromagnetic, the electricity coming into power plants to protect it. So you could, unlike a lot of nuclear issues, there's something you can do about this to protect them. But it's been the Nuclear Regulatory Commission and the utilities for the electric companies have fought it because it costs a lot of money. It costs like $1 billion. They don't want to spend the money. But if the cost of what it would incur if it actually happens and they're not protected is so far beyond $1 billion that it's really stupid. But that's how politics and business works. They don't. So that's a long answer, but
thank you so much. I appreciate
Sure.
that perspective. Because I just couldn't make sense of that. But we have a question for our speakers from Roberta, and she is asking our panel, what are some important things we can do to educate our communities on nuclear risk?
So am I the one to answer that?
Well, let's see. Yeah, if you want to answer that, or if one of our other.
Well, I think that when you start to try to discuss issues like that, one of the problems you have to overcome initially is that you have to sort of educate yourself and other people in order to explain what you're trying to talk about. And since these risks are not commonly discussed in the media, or I mean, you might see a nuclear bomb going off in a Terminator movie or something like that, but you're not going to really learn about all these things I discussed today unless you actually go to some trouble to find out about it. So it's not a bad idea to maybe consider joining up with or looking at least some of the websites like the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, they call it ICAN, or Physicians for Social Responsibility, or Beyond Nuclear. There's a number of organizations that have a lot of information that you can access there, and then they're all going to want you to become a member. And you don't have to join everything, but sometimes it's useful to become a member because you can learn more, and sometimes you feel like you're doing more if you're part of a group that's working on something. But I think that I think that might be the first step, is that if you're going to try to educate somebody, you have to educate yourself first. So I would look at those resources.
Thank you. That's a good point. You're right. It is important that we educate ourselves so we can.
Well, when I give a talk, I always have to, my challenge is if I have 20 or 30 minutes, I got to spend the first 15 or 20 minutes trying to educate the audience about what I'm talking about. And a lot of people really don't like science or don't have a scientific background. So you have to try to make it where it's not technical enough that you lose people. But you don't dumb it down to the point where you don't really get the information across.
That's that is helpful. I guess I've heard that when you give a presentation, you have to tell them what you're going to tell them, and then you tell them and tell them that you told them.
David Swanson was probably better at that, and maybe Benjamin some of that. I've been ill for a while, and I'm recuperating, but I had a cancer treatment a couple months ago, and so I'm not. Maybe I'm just getting more absent-minded. But I know the information, but sometimes I don't get it out in a real coherent fashion.
Does anyone else here have another question? Dr. Yoshida?
What do you recommend to for ordinary people to encourage or join in abolishing the nukes?
Well, I think in college students, they're more apt to be involved in something if they're with people of their own age. Like, because you get a lot of the anti-nuclear groups have older guys in them, like me, gray hair or whatever. So there's a group called international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons. It's called ICAN. And they're actually centered in Australia, but they're international, and they won the Nobel Peace Prize about 3 or 4 years ago for their work. So they're not unknown. And the internet allows you to talk to people all over the place in a pretty rapid fashion. So I think that would be one thing to do. If the people get really involved in something in a particular organization, they can also, on campus, you can start your own group too. I would point towards joining an organization that you like as a first step, just because that way you can get educated and you can also get reinforcement, and the organization will support you too with activities and different things. It's a little harder than global warming, because you can say, well, I'm not going to buy a big car, I'm not going to use so much energy and that sort of thing, but it's you can't just say, well, I'm not going to buy nuclear weapons at Walmart anymore. It's a little more abstract. You have to take actions that are beyond the individual at the community and national level.
So I know we're getting short on time, but Mr. Starr, you mentioned that you don't think that nuclear power is a viable option. I think I've heard there was a program on Channel 9 recently, very recently, but they were saying that the United States hasn't really done anything with nuclear power in 50 years because of the was it Love Island incident, and that it's been 50 years since we've really researched in nuclear power. So you're saying that you don't think that
there's a lot of arguments you can make. Like a typical nuclear power plant can take 7 to 10 years to construct, and it's a very capital intensive thing. And because like in Georgia, I think they were trying to build 3 reactors in the US in the last 5 years or so. And then they have to fund it. So part of the funding got to be where they're charging the ratepayers, the people that are getting electricity, and their bills were going up 40 and 50% for a plant that was half built. So that causes a lot of problems. I basically have I would consider an ethical issue about just creating nuclear waste, because it's so toxic and you have to keep it out of the biosphere for like at least 100,000 years or so. There's a place in Finland called Onkalo where they're building it underground in granite. It's going to take them over 100 years to construct it, but it'll keep all the waste from their 7 nuclear power plants there. But that's kind of like building this 21st century tomb, that lasts forever. There's a really good documentary called Into Eternity. It's called about Onkalo. It's Onkalo in Finland. It describes what they're doing there, and it makes you really think about it. When they talk to the guys that are in charge of it, they say, do you think this will be okay? And they say, well, we think in 30,000 years, 35,000 years, there'll be another ice age, and then all traces of and I started thinking, 35,000 years. I mean, that's about when Neanderthals were walking around in the past, So you're trying to deal with geologic periods of time to keep this stuff out of the environment. And I think it's a pretty ambitious task. And if you're using it just so you can keep all the lights on in St. Louis and make more beer cans, it's not worth it. It's just, I think that, the truly sustainable energy from sun and wind and tides, it's got a lot of issues because, it's not, on all the time like a nuclear power plant. You can, it gets dark and the wind doesn't blow, but a part of that gets down to energy storage. And I think that they're developing batteries and storage systems now that are efficient enough that it's a lot easier technical problem to store electricity overnight than it is to deal with nuclear waste for the next 100,000 years. But the nuclear companies have legislated this so that they walk away from the problem once the plant's closed. It becomes a public problem. And they actually make a lot of money when, they make $1 million profit. That's clear. That's net, not gross, per day on a nuclear power plant. It's highly profitable. But they're not truthful about some of the things they say. Well, it's just a small amount of waste. You could stack it all on a football field. And well, if that was true, then they would have done it. But if you stacked all that on a football field 8 feet tall, it would blow up, because you can't put all that stuff. The biggest problem with underground storage is the amount of heat that the waste generates, because you put it in these steel containers, but it still creates heat. My neighbor is a Boilermaker, and he welds the top of those things closed, and it's about 160 degrees on the top of that. It's his shoes they start to melt sometimes, and it's like putting an iron in a box that's turned on and closing the lid. It gets pretty hot in the box. And that's the amount of heat that they store is one of the main considerations on the size and all that. They built a place in Nevada called Yucca Mountain where they were going to store the waste from the US, but it was in a salt domes. And they thought, well, there's nothing, no water gets here and everything. But then it turns out that when you put a whole lot of heat inside of the salt, it actually attracts water. So it was going to create a brine solution that was going to be highly corrosive to the steel containers. So that was, the place in Anklo was granite, but when you watch the movie, they still show water dripping down the walls, and it makes you wonder, like, well, will it get out anyway? So I don't know. So I just and like I mentioned briefly, every time you fission uranium, you're producing plutonium, and then you have the dual issue of if you reprocess that, they call it, use chemical. Actually, they use nitric acid to dissolve the fuel rods to get the plutonium out. And then we've got a place in Hanford, Washington, that's where they first built the first reactors to make the atomic bombs that they dropped on Nagasaki with plutonium. And they built more reactors there after the war. There's about 600 square miles there that's highly contaminated. It's more contaminated than Chernobyl. You don't hear about it here, but it's the largest, what do they call it, environmental superfund in the United States. And they have 53 million gallons of that waste that's generated from reprocessing. It's mostly, highly acidic nitric acid, highly radioactive, toxic waste in underground storage tanks that are leaking. So those are the kind of problems that you create, with plutonium, not to mention what happens if you shoot a nuclear weapon off. We have something like 17,000 plutonium pits from dismantled nuclear weapons that they store in Texas at a place called Pantex. In a way that's good because it came from all these weapons they dismantled by reducing, but they write these treaties so they don't get rid of that stuff. They just keep it in case they might want to use it later on. And right now my friend out in New Mexico is fighting because they're wanting to spend a lot of money to build a new plutonium pit factory out there to make more nuclear weapons. And so those are the kind of things that go on behind the scenes that we never hear about, we don't think about. And I think, like it was said earlier, if we just take some of this money, we didn't spend it on military and spend it to help people, clothe and feed and educate and get rid of so much of the suffering in the world, then that might, maybe make it less likely there would be wars. It's greed and corruption and all that with all these gigantic weapons programs and things. And I think that your elders, people, the statesmen and your Buddhists they might be able to figure it out better than I could. I'm just I'm trying to just write about it to warn people. But
Thank you very much. Thank you. Any other, I think maybe, well, I was going to say we have time for one more question, but I think it is time for the conclusion. So thank you very much to everyone who has attended today, and thanks very much to our speakers for enlightening us. And yeah, it's just some invaluable information shared today. So we are very grateful to all of the speakers today. So Dr. Kongsak, if we can hand it back over to you for the dedication of merit.
Okay, we'll do a sharing of loving kindness. So basically, you set your mind as if you're a broadcasting station and broadcast your goodness and loving kindness to all beings, including yourself. You have to have a strong base so that you can continue to do wholesome work and so on. So we'll start together. May I be happy. May I be free from stress and pain. May I be free from animosity. May I be free from oppression. May I be free from trouble. May I look after myself with ease. Next slide, please. May all living beings be happy. May all living beings be free from animosity. May all living beings be free from oppression. May all living beings be free from trouble. May all living beings look after themselves with ease. May all living beings be free from all stress and suffering. May all living beings not be deprived of the good fortune they have attained. All living beings are the owners of their karma, heir to their karma, born of their karma, related through their karma, and live dependently on their karma. Whatever they do for good or for evil, to that will therefore heir. May there be every good blessings. May the Devas protect you. By the power of all the Buddhas, may you forever be well. May there be every good blessings. May the Devas protect you. By the power of the Dharma, may you forever be well. May there be every good blessings. May the Devas protect you. By the power of the Sangha, may you forever be well. Thank you for your attendance.
Thank you, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day. And there is the slide there if you're able to make a contribution to the St. Louis Area Food Bank. And our next event will be Vesak Day on June the 12th. So we will hope that you can join us again on Vesak Day for a celebration of the birth, enlightenment, and parinibbana of the Buddha. Good afternoon.
Thank you.